when we talk about underfueling, when we talk about fueling, like let's define that first, how, it works at RBSN. I think with fueling, when we're talking about that, we're talking about getting the right amount of energy, the right amount of nutrients, and at the right times.
Hello and welcome to the Eat More Carbs podcast. My name is Jenna Fisher and I'm here with my co-host Reilly Beatty. Today we're going to be talking all about underfueling.
Before we jump into today's episode, if you want to hang out with Jenna and myself even more, you can now apply for our 101 Sports Nutrition Coaching Program. We'll make sure that we drop the link below so you can apply today.
Before we get into some of our questions about underfueling, Reilly, how's your week been? What's your high and low?
So my high and low for this week is one and the same. I'm going to start off with my low like I usually do, and that low actually does turn into a high. The low for this week is I actually have decided that I am going to scale back my training. I was training for a marathon in November, and I've decided that instead of running the marathon, I'm going to run the half marathon, which was not an easy decision. It's something I've been really wanting to do for the last couple of years, but just being postpartum right now, there's lots of things going on, RBSN wise, personal reasons wise as well. So I've decided that instead of doing the marathon, I'm going to do the half marathon. And my high in that is I'm going to PR in the half marathon. So that's my goal for that. And it's just like when we work with our clients and our athletes, we have to listen to our body. We have to make sure that we're, prioritizing fueling and, being kind to our body. I was not necessarily doing that with, the marathon training. And I knew that to get the results that I wanted, I was not going to be able to do that with where my body is currently.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that sometimes we get really stuck on the goal that we have, but it's okay to adjust our goals and to adjust things based on like where we're at in life and other things going on that might impact our progress towards those goals.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's just like when we work with clients and athletes, right? Like sometimes they come to us, for maybe weight loss or something like that. And then there's so many different things that change throughout their time working with us. And weight loss, it's something that comes with, working on your nutrition, making you more like an optimal athlete. But there's so many other things that you start to focus on, I think, throughout your nutrition journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that.
What about you? What is your high and your low?
My high for the week, my mom used to make this chicken when we grew up. She called it dancing chickens because she would grill them like standing up, if that makes sense, for a long period of time, which is really funny. But I don't have a grill where I live. It's not really allowed in the little complex neighborhood that we live in. And I wanted to like recreate that flavor, but I couldn't do it like in my oven. I can't like stand a whole chicken up in there. Also, like the idea of cooking a whole bird in my oven just kind of freaked me out. I didn't want to do it. I recreated the recipe with just like pieces of chicken, and I actually think it turned out really good. So my high is that like I had this very nostalgic meal. I'm going to share it with everyone here soon. And I'm just really happy about how that turned out because it was like really good and also really nostalgic. So even if you do have like limited cooking equipment, limited cooking skills, like it's a super easy recipe to still recreate something that feels like super fun and fancy. My low, on the other hand, is kind of tied into the fact that it's approaching the super hot time of year here in Arizona. My husband and I usually take our dog out at the end of the day after dinner. My husband wasn't home and my dog does not like to go without the both of us. It's just like his deal. And I was dragging my poor dog down the road because he was just like throwing on the brakes. And I got back to my house and I was so sweaty and so disgusting from like literally just taking my dog out to like use the restroom that I needed to shower again. So it has reached that point of the year again where it's above 100 degrees.
I don't know if you've seen this account on like Instagram or TikTok, but there's this guy that always holds up a sign. I think is like a dude with a sign.
Yes.
And recently he just posted like it's 2 shower season.
Yeah.
And I was like, yes, it is. 2 showers a day.
Absolutely. That has never been more true for me. Reilly, today we're going to be talking about underfueling, the importance of fuelings, what happens when we underfuel. So can you just kind of give us like an overview, especially as someone who works very consistently with athletes, like what is the importance of fueling and what can happen to an athlete? What can happen to our performance if we aren't fueling properly?
So you know that we're all about the why. So we're going to start off the why, the how. We're going to do some definitions first because I think underfueling gets thrown around a lot, especially on social media. So So when we talk about underfueling, when we talk about fueling, like let's define that first, how, it works at RBSN. I think with fueling, when we're talking about that, we're talking about getting the right amount of energy, the right amount of nutrients, and at the right times. And this is going to be different for every single person. Something that you and I always talk about with our, clients and athletes at the beginning is, the 6 essential nutrients. We have 6 of these essential nutrients that we have to get through food, we have to get through drink, and you need the right combination of these 6 nutrients to be the best human and the best athlete. At least when I'm talking about fueling, I'm talking about that right combination.
What happens, especially with performance, when we aren't reaching those right combination of things?
So we're going to obviously see a drop in performance if we are underfueling, right? We're going to see, poor decision making. We're not going to see as much energy. That's all really important, if you're an athlete. But we're also a human and a person before we're just an athlete. So we're also going to see negative health effects from that as well. And if we're not being the best person, we cannot be the best athlete.
I think one of the things that we see often is athletes who have maybe identified some of these things that you've mentioned, but aren't quite ready to take the step or don't know how to take the step, don't know who to get in contact with about proper fueling, or maybe don't know that that's the root cause of why they're feeling that way. So what are maybe some signs or symptoms of these things that parents, coaches, or even other nutritional professionals should look out for in athletes to maybe identify that we aren't meeting our fueling needs?
I think this can be one of the most challenging things to identify. And I would love to hear what you have to say about this as well, because I think when we look at female athletes, it's really easy to tell that an athlete is underfueling if she has an irregular menstrual cycle. I feel like that's a really easy, symptom or sign of underfueling. But some of the other, signs and symptoms of underfueling, like poor digestion, fatigue, poor mental function, slower decision making, are sometimes really hard to identify or even self-identify it with that as well. A lot of the athletes that we work with don't realize that they're underfueling and don't realize that they have a lot of these symptoms until they start, eating the right amount at the right times. And they often wonder how they were able to function beforehand. But sometimes when you're in the thick of it, you just don't really realize what's happening.
On a previous podcast, we talked with Janasa, who's a campus dietitian, and she was talking about how when she was working with athletes, when they would start to implement carbohydrates right before their game, their practice, what have you, they would come back to her and be like, oh my gosh, I felt like I had energy through that. And I know that's something you and I both experience with the clients and athletes that we work with, is that just like you said, sometimes we don't even recognize that these are the things that are happening to us until we're on the other side of that. So what would you maybe recommend to someone who's maybe curious about, is my lack of energy that I'm feeling on the field or at practice due to the fact that I'm not fueling enough? Like, what would be something that they could try to see if maybe they fall into that category of underfueling?
So we love the performance plate method, right? That's a really easy way to kind of implement, the right ratio of nutrients in meals, but that can be super overwhelming and it can be kind of like hard maybe, and, a little challenging to do it yourself. So if you are somebody who's maybe just beginning this journey, maybe a little bit nervous, I always recommend, going after that pre and post training fueling, right? Like, how are we bookending our practice or our training session with good nutrition? Because again, we might not even know that this is happening. Even if we are not feeling, some of these outward symptoms or they're not as obvious, we can still try to be a better athlete by working on some nutrient timing. Nobody has ever worked on their nutrition and gotten better at their nutrition and regretted doing that, because being better with your nutrition, no matter how great of an athlete you are, is just going to make you a better athlete.
What are some things that we could try to put maybe before and after a practice to start implementing that pre and post nutrition strategy? Like, what would be a good thing to have, or what would be a good thing to try?
I love simple carbohydrates, and I know you do too, especially before your runs. I love simple carbohydrates before training, usually 30 to 60 grams, about 30 to 60 minutes before. When you work, with a dietitian on an individualized basis, we really, customize that based off of your training, your priorities, your gut, right, your digestion. But that's kind of like a general guideline to get started with. We want those simple, easy to digest carbohydrates to make sure that we have enough energy available, and topping off those energy stores to make sure that you have good energy throughout your entire practice. And then afterwards, really kickstarting recovery with general 3-to-1 ratio of carbs to protein. Again, we see athletes that have a 2-to-1 ratio of carbs to protein. We have a 4-to-1 ratio for certain athletes as well, but really looking at, that 3-to-1 ratio of carbs to protein. For most athletes, that's going to be about maybe 60 grams of carbohydrates, 20 grams of protein.
For someone who's new to fueling and new to the idea of nutrition, what is an example of something that they could have after practice that would provide that 3-to-1 carbs to protein ratio?
Worst case scenario, scenario. This is like worst case scenario. You could have a protein shake, which is 20 grams of protein, and you could have 2 bananas, and that's 60 grams of carb and 20 grams of protein. If you're looking for something a little bit more meal-like, 3 eggs is 21 grams of protein. You could have some bread with that, 2 pieces of bread, some fruit salad. That's probably getting you close to 60 grams of carbs.
And there's a lot of talk about like timing of nutrients after we've had a workout, a practice, or a game. And typically we hear like 20 grams within 20 minutes, 20 grams of protein within 20 minutes of finishing that workout. Is that true? Is that a good kind of standard to follow? Or is it better to aim for that 3-to-1 carbs to protein ratio within a specific amount of time post-workout?
I think it goes back to, it really depends on the situation. If you're an athlete that has another training session within 8 to 12 hours, we usually recommend, getting in something ASAP, right? As soon as possible. Obviously, we want to get something in as soon as possible to kind of kickstart recovery and to help. Another thing is we want to have you fuel as soon as possible to make sure that you're not under fueling, because when we have multiple training sessions in a day, we're time restricted on when we can fuel, because we have to make sure that we have proper digestion, we're not having, GI upset, and we have limited feeding times. So that getting in fuel as soon as possible has almost like a dual benefit from that period of time. So kind of general rule of thumb is if you are, training again within 8 to 12 hours, trying to get something in as soon as possible. If you're somebody who's not training multiple times a day, you're not as time restricted, recovery has a little bit more flexibility. I say try to have a full meal within 2 hours. And if you can't have a full meal within 2 hours, try to have a post-workout snack within, 30 minutes to an hour.
When it comes to making sure that we are adequately fueled, like we've talked about before, working one-on-one with a dietitian is a great way to make sure that's individualized and your needs are met. But what are some ways that athletes could tell that they are getting closer to those energy needs? Like what would they be feeling? What would they be experiencing? What would they be looking out for?
I think the biggest thing that most of our athletes see immediately is an increase in energy. I would say that is going to be the biggest thing. This is something I do feel like you don't always know that you are experiencing when you're under fueling, because you don't realize how much more energy that you could have. So I think that is the biggest thing that we see with immediate, I think that's the biggest thing that we see quickly.
Do you often see athletes that report that they're not feeling tired all day long, that they have better attention in class, things like that kind of come along with that, those secondary benefits that we get from adequate fueling beyond just what we think of as performance benefits on the field?
Yes. We don't have our 2 p.m. or 3 p.m. slump anymore. Another thing too is I think with proper fueling, we're not going to have as many, crashes. And then we also are not going to find as much munching or, starving at the end of the day. So that's a big thing. A lot of, athletes really struggle when they're under fueling with, binging at night or eating a big meal at night because they're ravenous, and that's their body playing catch up because they've been under fueling all day long. And that can be very, very stressful. And so when we can, stabilize fueling, make sure that we have enough energy throughout the entire day, and we can take away that, stressor at night, it can be less stressful for the athlete, and it can really free up some of their time as well.
What would be the 3 biggest tips that you have for making sure, or 3 starting steps that you have for athletes to start working towards consistently fueling throughout the day, to work towards adequate fueling to prevent that under fueling like we're talking about?
Yeah, we love the performance plate method. Depending on what type of athlete you are, whether that's a training day plate, a moderate run day plate, I recommend starting there. An easy way to remember, maybe the most important thing, I guess, from this entire podcast is make 1/3 of your plate carbohydrates, 1/3 of your plate color, which is a fruit or vegetable, and 1/3 of your plate protein, and add, 2 to 3 servings of healthy fat on the side. I would recommend doing that performance plate 3 to 4 times per day. You want to eat, every, let's say 4 to 6 hours. So those are 2 big tips right there. And then making sure that we're getting enough water. We didn't really talk about hydration, but fueling and proper fueling incorporates all 6 essential nutrients, and water is one of those essential nutrients.
For people who aren't as familiar with the idea of 6 essential nutrients, what are those?
So our 6 essential nutrients include our 3 macronutrients, which are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. We have our micronutrients, which are vitamins and minerals, and then we have water.
I know that we could spend probably close to 3 hours talking about all the vitamins and minerals that we have and all of the processes that they assist with and all of the things that they do for our body, but can you give us just a general overview of the 3 big macronutrients as far as what they do and how they help with fueling and performance?
Carbohydrates, we're starting there. We're the Eat More Carbs podcast. That is our favorite essential nutrient. So carbohydrates are going to be our quick energy source, and they're going to also be our fuel for our vital organs. A lot of athletes are underfueling in carbohydrates, and therefore, once we start adding in more carbohydrates, we will see their energy levels increase. So it's interesting that one of the biggest problems that we see with our athletes is, a lack of energy, and then they're not eating enough carbohydrates. So lots of carbohydrates, it's going to help with our energy. Our protein is going to be our fuel for our muscle mass, right? We have muscles in our biceps, but also in our heart and our gut as well. So making sure that we're getting adequate protein is going to help, maintain that muscle mass. And then we have fat, which is our longer term source of energy. It's our energy source at rest. It's also going to be anti-inflammatory, which is a very popular word right now. So it's going to help our body manage inflammation. And it's also going to help us absorb some of those vitamins as well.
The performance plate method helps to make sure that you're getting all of the essential nutrients within a meal, spaced throughout the day, and working towards those performance goals, which is one of the reasons why our athletes, our runners, our clients love to use the performance plates in order to make sure that they are getting in all of those 6 essential nutrients throughout the day to prevent any type of underfueling and prevent any of those symptoms that you mentioned that are associated with underfueling. Do you have any final thoughts on underfueling? Any big takeaways that you would want athletes that are listening to this to know about the dangers of underfueling and steps we can take to prevent it?
The last thing I have to say is don't be afraid to increase your energy intake to prevent underfueling. I think as a society, we're so worried about overfueling that a lot of us, because of that fear, are underfueling. Most of the athletes that we work with are underfueling in some sort of capacity. They're not getting enough nutrients at the right time. So do not be worried about overfueling.
A lot of athletes need a lot of energy, and that's okay. If you have questions for Reilly and I about underfueling or energy needs, please feel free to reach out to us. You can drop questions that you have below this podcast, or you can find us on Instagram. We're at the Eat More Carbs podcast. You can find Reilly on Instagram at reilly.beatty.nutrition, and you can find me at jenna.fisher.nutrition. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please make sure you rate, subscribe, and review. And as always, remember to eat more carbs.